If I placed this blade in your hand and didn't tell you what it was made of, you would almost certainly assume it was steel. It looks sharp, it feels sharp, and the moment it touches meat, it doesn't hesitate. It doesn't tear. It slices clean through with almost no pressure at all. That's when I tell you something that shouldn't make sense. There is no metal here, no steel, no iron. This blade is stone. And in that moment, something uncomfortable happens. Because everything modern life has taught you about a sharpness suddenly feels unreliable. We grow up believing that real knives require metal, that before steel, tools were crude, dull, barely functional, that ancient people survived despite their tools, not because of them. It's a comforting story, and it's completely wrong. Long before metal existed, humans were making blades so sharp they could split flesh with almost no resistance. Edges sharper than most kitchen knives people use today. Edges so unforgiving that a single careless movement could mean injury. These weren't primitive approximations of real tools. They were real tools, designed for a world where precision wasn't optional. Because in that world, a dull blade wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. A dull edge meant more force. More force meant less control. Less control meant mistakes. And mistakes back then weren't inconveniences, they were risks. Ancient people didn't need knives that lasted for years. They needed knives that worked now. Clean cuts meant less time exposed, less struggle, less waste, less attention drawn to movement and sound. Sharpness wasn't a luxury. It was a form of safety. And here's the part that rarely gets talked about. We didn't stop using these blades because they failed. We stopped using them because they demanded too much from the person holding them. Stone blades were brutally honest tools. They didn't forgive sloppy technique. They didn't tolerate distraction. They required awareness, respect, and restraint. In exchange, they delivered something modern tools rarely do anymore: absolute precision. Modern knives are designed to be durable, convenient, and safe enough to use without thinking. Ancient knives were designed to be effective enough that you had to think. And when you see what a simple stone edge can do, the question stops being how ancient people managed without metal. The real question becomes far more unsettling. Why did we decide that sharpness was something to be softened? Why did we trade precision for comfort? And what else did we lose when we made that choice? Because once you understand how sharp these blades really were, it becomes impossible to see ancient tools as inferior. They weren't behind us. They were optimized for a different kind of world. Once you accept that these blades were truly sharp, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why did sharpness matter so much? Not in theory, not as a technical detail, but in the lived reality of ancient life. For early humans, cutting wasn't a minor task, it was a critical moment. Every cut decided how much effort came next, how much time was spent exposed, and how much energy was wasted. A clean cut meant control. A poor cut meant struggle. And struggle was dangerous. Sharpness reduced effort. Reduced effort preserved strength. Preserved strength increased survival. That chain mattered every single day. Processing meat wasn't fast or clean. It involved joints, sinew, hide, and bone. Materials that resist poorly controlled force. A dull blade demanded pressure. Pressure led to slips. Slips caused injuries. Even a small cut could become infected. Even a minor injury could become fatal. Sharpness wasn't about speed. It was about minimizing risk. This is something modern life has made easy to forget. Today, a cut finger is an inconvenience. In the ancient world, it was a liability. Blood loss, infection, reduced mobility. Each one increased vulnerability. A blade that required less force reduced all of those risks at once. The sharper the edge, the calmer the movement. The calmer the movement, the safer the task. That's why ancient blades prioritized sharpness over durability. A stone blade might chip. It might dull quickly, but while it was sharp, it was unmatched. It sliced instead of tearing. It separated fibers cleanly. It respected the structure of the material rather than fighting it. That respect translated directly into efficiency. Efficiency mattered because time mattered. Ancient people couldn't afford to linger. Processing food took place in exposed environments. Scents carried, sounds traveled. Attention was drawn. The faster and cleaner a task was completed, the safer everyone became. A sharp blade shortened that window of risk, and sharpness also meant precision. Precision allowed intentional cuts instead of brute force. It allowed careful separation rather than violent tearing. That precision preserved usable material, less waste, more food, better outcomes. The blade wasn't just a cutting tool. It was a way of managing limited resources intelligently. This is where modern assumptions quietly break down. We often equate durability with quality. A tool that lasts longer feels superior. But ancient priorities were different. A blade that lasted a long time but cut poorly was less valuable than a blade that cut perfectly for a short time. Reliability wasn't measured in lifespan. It was measured in performance at the moment it mattered. Stone blades excelled at that. They didn't pretend to be permanent. They embraced replacement. When an edge dulled, it was refreshed. When it chipped, a new edge was created. The material allowed renewal without complex processes. Sharpness could be restored quickly, often on the spot. That flexibility made stone blades practical in ways modern tools rarely are. And there's another layer to this. Sharp tools demand attention. They slow people down mentally, even as they speed tasks up physically. They force awareness, presence, care. In a world full of danger, that mindset mattered. Tools that punish carelessness teach discipline. Tools that forgive everything encourage distraction. Ancient blades trained behavior as much as they performed tasks. This is why the loss of extreme sharpness wasn't accidental. As society stabilized, priorities shifted. Convenience became valuable. Safety became desirable. Durability became a selling point. Blades became less demanding, less honest, less dangerous to the user, but also less precise. Sharpness was traded for comfort, and in doing so, something subtle changed. Tools no longer required the same level of awareness. The relationship between hand, material, and outcome became softer, more forgiving, but also less intentional. Ancient people didn't romanticize sharpness. They respected it. They understood its cost and its value. They accepted the responsibility that came with using tools that didn't protect them from their own mistakes. Because in their world, attention was part of survival. And that's why sharpness mattered so deeply. Not as a feature, not as a metric, but as a philosophy. A belief that tools should do their job completely, even if that meant demanding more from the person using them. Once you see sharpness this way, stone blades stop being primitive. They become precise responses to a world where control, efficiency, and awareness were inseparable. And that understanding sets the stage for the next question. If sharpness didn't come from metal, then where did it really come from? If sharpness didn't come from metal, then it had to come from something else. And the answer isn't hidden in lost techniques or forgotten genius. It's hidden in the way stone breaks. When most people hear the word stone, they imagine something blunt, heavy, resistant, the opposite of sharp. But stone doesn't behave the way we assume it does. Certain types of stone fracture in a very specific way. When struck correctly, they don't crumble. They split. and that split creates edges so thin they approach molecular sharpness. This is the part modern intuition struggles with. Metal becomes sharp through grinding, through abrasion, through removing material slowly until an edge is formed. Stone becomes sharp through fracture. A single, controlled break can create an edge thinner than anything produced by casual sharpening. The edge isn't polished. It's fresh, untouched, and dangerously precise. Ancient people didn't need to understand this scientifically. They learned it by observation. Some stones broke cleanly, others shattered. Some produced jagged edges that dulled immediately. Others created long, razor-like surfaces that held their sharpness just long enough to matter. Those stones were remembered, passed along, chosen again. This is why materials like flint, obsidian, and chert appear again and again in ancient sites across the world. Not because they were rare, but because they behaved predictably. They fractured in ways that produced consistent, controllable edges. When used correctly, those edges were sharper than steel, just not as durable. And durability wasn't the goal. A stone blade wasn't meant to survive years of abuse. It was meant to perform perfectly in a critical moment. The moment a cut mattered. The moment control mattered. The moment hesitation could become danger. What's unsettling is how sharp these edges actually were. Modern surgeons still use obsidian blades for certain procedures today. Not because they're nostalgic, but because an obsidian edge can be smoother at a microscopic level than even the best steel scalpel. Less tearing, cleaner incisions, more control. The technology didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it didn't fit modern priorities. Stone blades required maintenance, attention, replacement. They demanded engagement from the person using them. Metal offered something different: longevity, convenience, a blade you could rely on without constant care. But that convenience came with a trade-off. Metal edges are tougher, but they're also thicker. They cut through force. Stone edges cut through precision. One resists damage, the other minimizes resistance. Ancient people chose the option that reduced effort and risk in the moment, even if it meant replacing the tool later. This is where modern thinking often misjudges ancient choices. We see replacement as inefficiency. They saw it as flexibility. A chipped stone blade wasn't failure. It was an opportunity to create a new edge. The material allowed renewal without infrastructure. No forge, no fuel, no specialized equipment. Sharpness could be restored with a single strike. That ability mattered in unstable environments. Ancient people couldn't depend on permanence. They depended on responsiveness. Tools that adapted quickly were more valuable than tools that lasted a long time. Stone blades fit that reality perfectly. And there's another detail that's easy to miss. Stone blades didn't encourage brute force. Their sharpness punished it. Apply too much pressure and the edge chips. Move too aggressively and the blade breaks. This forced a different style of movement. Slower, more deliberate, more controlled. The blade shaped behavior as much as it shaped material. In that sense, stone knives weren't just tools. They were teachers. They taught restraint. They taught awareness. They taught precision. Metal blades, by contrast, tolerate force. They forgive mistakes. They allow distraction. That's not inherently bad, but it changes the relationship between user and tool. Ancient people lived in a world where attention was survival. Their tools reflected that reality. So when we ask how sharpness existed without metal, the answer isn't technological. It's philosophical. Sharpness came from understanding material behavior, accepting replacement, and valuing performance over permanence. Stone blades weren't inferior precursors to real knives. They were optimized responses to a world where sharpness mattered more than comfort, and precision mattered more than longevity. Theory only goes so far. Sharpness sounds impressive when we talk about it, but ancient tools weren't trusted because of explanations. They were trusted because they worked. So instead of debating how sharp a stone blade should be, it's better to watch what actually happens when it's used. The first contact is always surprising. There's no dramatic motion, no forceful push. The blade barely moves and the material gives way. Not because of pressure, but because resistance disappears. The cut doesn't tear, it doesn't drag. It separates cleanly, almost quietly. That silence is important. It tells you how little energy is being wasted. What becomes immediately clear is how little force is required. The hand stays relaxed. The wrist stays steady. The blade does the work. This isn't brute strength. It's geometry. A microscopic edge meets material at just the right angle, and the material has no choice but to part. And this is where modern assumptions break. Most people expect stone tools to require effort, to feel clumsy, to struggle. Instead, the opposite happens. The sharper the edge, the calmer the movement becomes. There's no need to rush, no need to push harder. In fact, pushing harder makes things worse. Stone blades punish aggression. They reward control. As different materials are tested, the pattern holds. Fibers separate cleanly. Surfaces open without resistance. The blade doesn't wedge or bind, it glides. Not because it's strong, but because it's thin. Strength isn't doing the work here. Precision is. This changes how the user behaves. Movements slow down. Hands become deliberate. Attention sharpens. The blade demands respect. Not because it looks dangerous, but because it reacts instantly to every mistake. A wrong angle chips the edge. Too much pressure ends the cut abruptly. The tool gives immediate feedback. That feedback is what made these blades practical. Ancient people didn't rely on tools that hid their limits. They relied on tools that revealed them. When a stone blade failed, it failed honestly. And that honesty taught better technique. Over time, users learned to move with restraint, not force. What's also noticeable is how quickly an edge can be renewed. A damaged blade isn't useless. A single controlled strike can expose a new edge just as sharp as the last. There's no waiting, no complex process. Sharpness returns immediately. That responsiveness mattered in environments where time and energy were limited. Modern knives don't work this way. They trade responsiveness for durability. They tolerate rough handling. They forgive sloppy technique. And in doing so, they separate the user from the cutting process. The blade becomes something you press harder instead of something you work with. Stone blades don't allow that distance. They keep the user involved, present, engaged. Every cut is a conversation between hand, edge, and material, and that intimacy is what made them effective for so long. There's another subtle difference that testing reveals. Stone blades don't encourage excess. They don't invite unnecessary cuts. Each movement feels intentional. Each action feels final. In a survival context, that mattered. Waste wasn't just inefficient. It was dangerous. A tool that encourages careful use shapes behavior in ways modern tools rarely do. Watching a stone blade work doesn't feel like watching primitive technology. It feels like watching a different design philosophy. One that values precision over permanence, awareness over convenience, effectiveness over comfort. And when you see how effortlessly these blades perform their task, it becomes clear why ancient people trusted them. Not because they lasted forever, but because when they were needed, they performed perfectly. That's the kind of reliability that matters when failure isn't an option. Stone blades weren't impressive in a modern sense. They didn't shine. They didn't promise safety. They didn't protect careless hands. But they delivered something far more important: control. And once you've seen that control in action, it becomes impossible to dismiss these tools as crude or inferior. They weren't missing metal, they were missing compromise. After seeing how well these blades perform, the obvious question isn't why ancient people used them. It's why we stopped. Because if stone knives were this sharp, this precise, and this effective, their disappearance can't be explained by failure. Something else changed, and what changed wasn't the blade, it was the world around it. Stone knives didn't vanish because they were inferior. They vanished because they asked too much from the person using them. They demanded attention, they demanded restraint, they demanded constant awareness. And as societies became more stable, that level of engagement became unnecessary and eventually undesirable. As human environments shifted, priorities shifted with them. Settlements grew. Food sources became more predictable. Tasks became repetitive rather than urgent. In that context, durability started to matter more than precision. A blade that stayed usable without constant maintenance became more attractive than one that performed perfectly but required care. Metal answered that new priority. Metal blades weren't sharper than stone. They were tougher. They lasted longer. They tolerated mistakes. You could cut faster, press harder, pay less attention, and the blade would still work. That forgiveness felt like progress. And in many ways it was, but forgiveness comes with a cost. Metal edges are thicker. They rely more on force than finesse. They tear where stone slices. They allow speed at the expense of precision. For everyday life in a settled world, that trade-off made sense. Convenience replaced vigilance. Safety replaced sharpness. And slowly, the stone blade became unnecessary. Not obsolete, unnecessary. There's a difference. Stone knives were optimized for moments when every action mattered, when time was short, when mistakes were dangerous, when attention was survival. As life became safer, tools that required constant attention felt excessive. Why maintain a blade when you could own one that simply lasted? This is how technologies disappear most often. Not because they stop working, but because the problems they were designed to solve stop being common. As metalworking spread, societies gained infrastructure. Forges, trade networks, specialization, replacement no longer depended on immediate availability. A broken blade could be repaired or replaced later. That safety net changed how tools were valued. Stone blades offered immediacy. Metal blades offered continuity, and continuity won. But something subtle was lost in that transition. Stone knives trained behavior. They enforced careful movement. They punished force. They rewarded patience. They shaped how people interacted with materials. Metal knives removed that feedback loop. They absorbed mistakes instead of reflecting them. Over time, the relationship between hand and blade softened. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. A choice to prioritize ease over awareness, durability over sharpness, comfort over precision. And once that choice was made, stone blades no longer fit. They weren't dangerous to enemies, they were dangerous to careless users. In a modern context, that's unacceptable. Tools are expected to protect us from ourselves. Ancient tools did the opposite. They assumed responsibility. They assumed attention. They assumed presence. That assumption doesn't scale well in a world built around speed and convenience. And yet, the logic behind stone blades never stopped being valid. When precision matters. When clean cuts matter. When control matters more than force. That's why stone blades never fully disappeared. They retreated into niches, into specialized uses, into contexts where their strengths still mattered. Even today, when absolute precision is required, their logic quietly returns. Not because we're nostalgic, but because physics hasn't changed. Stone knives didn't fail history. History outgrew the conditions that made them necessary. And that realization reframes how we think about progress. It suggests that technological change isn't always about improvement. Sometimes it's about preference, about what we choose to value as our world becomes safer, slower, and more forgiving. Stone blades remind us of a time when sharpness wasn't softened for comfort, when tools didn't hide consequences, when precision was a responsibility, not a feature. They didn't disappear because they were behind us. They disappeared because we chose a different relationship with our tools. When you step back from the blade and look at the story as a whole, something becomes clear. Stone knives weren't a failed step on the way to metal. They were a complete solution to a world that demanded attention. These tools didn't protect the user from mistakes. They exposed them. They didn't soften consequences. They made them visible. And because of that, they shaped behavior as much as they shaped material. Every cut required presence. Every movement required intention. The blade worked perfectly, but only if the person using it did too. That relationship feels unfamiliar today. Modern tools are designed to disappear into the background, to be safe enough that we don't have to think, durable enough that we don't have to care, convenient enough that mistakes rarely matter. That's not a flaw. It's a reflection of a world where most risks have been removed. But ancient people lived in a different reality. In that world, attention wasn't optional. It was survival. Tools didn't just perform tasks. They trained awareness. They demanded respect. And stone blades were among the most honest tools ever made. They offered incredible precision, but only in exchange for responsibility. That's why they feel unsettling now. Not because they're dangerous, but because they remind us of a time when sharpness came with accountability. When tools didn't cushion us from the consequences of our actions. When skill mattered more than convenience. Stone knives didn't disappear because they were worse. They disappeared because the world became safer. Because systems grew more forgiving. Because we chose tools that asked less of us. And in doing so, we changed something subtle. We changed how we interact with materials, how we move our hands, how much attention we give to simple acts. The stone blade isn't a relic of ignorance. It's a record of priorities, a reminder that precision once mattered more than comfort, that awareness once mattered more than speed, that sharpness wasn't something to be dulled for safety. It was something to be respected. And that lesson doesn't belong to the past, because every time we design a tool, a system, or a solution, we make the same choice ancient people did. Do we build something that hides consequences, or something that teaches us to live with them? Stone knives answer that question quietly. They don't argue, they don't persuade. They simply show what happens when a tool is designed for a world where attention matters. Sometimes, progress isn't about making tools safer. Sometimes, it's about remembering why they were sharp in the first place.